I know what the 900 years in Genesis means. It's not what you think it is. It's code. But we can isolate it and look at it and see it for ourselves and understand what it actually is.
All right, let's see it.
Please understand up front, this is not numerology. It is not Gematria. This is something that is visibly accessible once we look at it in a certain way. My name is Dan Paulson. Welcome to the video. 900 years. Those are claims. Most people that know the Bible, know Genesis, and know that those are claims. 900 years, 800 years, 700, 600. There's these blocks of long duration years that people are said to have lived. Lineages are going on there. But what I've determined in those two lineages, one in chapter 5 and one in chapter 11, is that those are codes. They're gathering numbers. I'm going to show you how the 900 means 7, and the 7 means pure state. Yeah, there's some weird stuff going on, but I'm going to forewarn you, there's a lot of layers to it. It's not simple, or we would have figured it out. I have studied the Bible with an open mind and an eye to seeing commonalities in stories until I've got it figured out. Okay, now I'm going to tell you, I'll be using the King James Version. There are modifications made to later Bibles that just are not going to be okay. So I'm going to go as far upstream as I can, and King James Version is it. There's some reasons for that I can talk about as we get into it, but I should try to be brief here. Okay, so King James Version, we're going to be searching using the computer. What's important to understand here, we'd ask, what would you know that I don't know? I've studied this stuff and I know what's going on there. What I want to suggest is that we have to look at this in a different way. What we have to do is load Genesis in its most upstream form that we can into the computer, into a Word document or something similar, and do word searches in there. Long ago, they would have had these stories memorized, and there would be a requirement to have them deeply memorized. That would be something like this: "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." Okay, we all have that memorized, but is it deeply memorized? What does that mean? How many times was twinkle said? How about star? How about are? You start looking at that on a level of Genesis, though. How many times was Noah's name repeated? 41 times. How many times was Sarai's name repeated? 17 times. You start looking at things in the computer that it can show us that we are missing because of our lack of deep memorization. There's something there, and we're just not looking at it the right way. If we look at it with the computer, something is going to emerge that we can't see from our own studies. So, King James Version, using the computer to search. The next thing is that there are clues about what to do. We're going to learn how to find this, but what we're going to do is understand something about chapters and verses. They were not originally in the Bible. When these stories were first memorized, there was not chapter 1, verse 1 in the beginning. It wasn't like that. It just started off in the beginning. This is Genesis. All right. When the books of the Bible were originally written, they did not contain chapter or verse references. The Bible was divided into chapters and verses to help us find scriptures more quickly and easily. It is much easier to find John chapter 3, verse 16 than it is to find "For God so loved the world." In a few places, chapter breaks are poorly placed and as a result divide content that should flow together. Overall, though, the chapter and verse divisions are helpful. All right, I'm going to tell you right now, in a few places, chapter verses are poorly placed and as a result divide content that should flow together are pointers. Those are pointing something to us. We're going to look at those. It's going to start right off between chapter 1 and chapter 2 in Genesis when the two creation stories are not separated by a chapter. All right, the chapter divisions commonly used today were developed by Stephen Langton, an Archbishop of Canterbury. So we got a Catholic. Langton put the modern chapter divisions into place in around AD 1227. The Wycliffe English Bible of 1382 was the first Bible to use this chapter pattern. Since the Wycliffe Bible, nearly all Bible translations have followed Langton's chapter divisions. Okay, that means that Langton put the end of the first creation story into the beginning of chapter 2, which is the second creation story. So he's the one that didn't overlap that chapter in the right place. He knew what he was doing, though. It's not a mistake. He's pointing. All right, the Hebrew Old Testament was divided into verses by a Jewish rabbi by the name of Nathan in AD 1448. So the Hebrew Old Testament, the Old Testament was divided into verses in 48. Now somebody named Robert Estienne, who is also known as Stephanus, was the first to divide the New Testament into standard numbered verses in 1555. So originally, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all the way through were not divided into verses either. Remember back then, they've got them memorized. They're just flowing through. Those verses come about later as you're writing letters saying, I want to correspond with somebody. I need to ask you some questions about this. But you don't have references. So the chapters and verses are said to have been able to allow people to correspond someplace, talk to each other, or just dial right in, turn to page such and such or whatever. Plato said that because writing and reading was becoming so prevalent in his time that the depths of their knowledge was becoming very shallow. That now, instead of them just being able to engage in conversation back and forth about the depths of the material, they would have to go, I don't know, hang on a second, let me go look that up, that they didn't know it the same way. That's what we're experiencing here with us today. We don't have it at their depth. Stephanus essentially used Nathan's verse division for the Old Testament. Since that time, beginning with the Geneva Bible, the chapter and verse divisions employed by Stephanus have been accepted into nearly all Bible versions. Now, despite that time frame there, Stephanus is colluding with Langton. Langton is pointing something out, but not very clearly. Stephanus is making it more clear. What the heck is that? Okay, straight to Genesis. Here we go. First of all, we know we have two creation stories. Everybody should be on board with that. If not, there's a couple of things you can look at here. Number one, there's differences between them, but even the styles. One of them is a doublet, and God said, and so there was, and God said, and so there was, and God saw that it was good, and all of that. That goes all the way down to the seventh day, and then God rested on the seventh day, so everything was finished. And if you look through there also, you will see it always references and God, and God, and God. God, God, God. There's never any variation to that. It is God every time in reference. Once you get down into the second story, that actually doesn't start until verse 4 of chapter 2. These are the generations of the heavens of the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Lord God. Lord God, Lord God. It's never anything but Lord God. These are two different authors, one using God, one using Lord God. Why did they overlap it here? It doesn't belong there. That should belong right here. The reason is this. This number 7 and this number 3 are going to be crucial. We might not figure it out. We've got a seventh day, rested on the seventh day, and God blessed the seventh day. Seventh is repeated 3 times in there. But we might not catch that, but we might catch how come he put that overlap here. That's a goofy thing to do. You know what? He's saying, hello, McFly, 7 and 3. Actually, the overlap in chapters by Langton didn't identify it this closely. It was Stephanus later that put these verses in and that overlapped them in like that. I still see Langton's there. You would ask yourself, perhaps, how come we have seventh said 3 times in the beginning of chapter 2? But it wouldn't be on verse 3. It would still be just one chapter flow through like that. So you can see that third one being on verse 3, it's kind of there's a couple of things to look at. There's a few subtle things here pointing for you. That's how I read it eventually. That is so we will understand something. A 7 and 3 is an important starting point. The numbering pattern is going to be used throughout the Bible to designate something. The numbers are going to be analogous for something. 7 right here and 3. 3, honestly, if you go up into day 3, that's where God decided to create the trees that put out the seeds, that created more seeds within them, and they did. That's cause and effect right there. All spiritual And encoded teachings like this have got cause and effect somehow nested into it. Buddha's going to say karma, which sounds, pretty plain language. Jesus is going to say the measure you mete into others will be likewise meted unto you. So this cause and effect is always a part of human life. And that's what it's teaching us. You're going to live through cause and effect. And the choices you make and the way that you hold them emotionally upstairs are going to continue to affect you throughout life. That's what it's going to teach us. That's nested into this story. 7, naked, unashamed in the Garden of Eden. Another layer. Every one of us is Adam and Eve. This represents each human being connected with the higher awareness. That's why at first there's only God and Adam. There's no memory. Until you name some things. Once you name some things, then Eve emerges from you. That's the inner self. We are now our higher self, our consciousness, and our memories, the things that we've learned, the things that we live through, our self-awareness. Naming means learning. I have named this. I mean, at first you're naming very benign things. We name things like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I know how to talk. I know what tastes good. I know what colors are. All those. That means naming something, learning something. Later on, we're going to learn things like, oh, that's very ucky. Oh, yeah, that's painful. That's shameful. Now I'm hurt. All of that is naming. Naming is what we become. But we are unashamed, naked in the Garden of Eden. That's the joyful childhood point before we experience the pain, the hurt, shame, something like that. And that is what first sin is. The inner self becomes hurt. Both of your conscious and your subconscious, both. Adam and Eve, both. This is all psychological. Are now out of the Garden of Eden. Metaphorically, you're out of the mental space that was pure bliss. You're now experiencing something different. The pain in childbirth is the cyclical pain element as a result. The consciousness, you're going to go live off the land and not reap its full benefits. We're going to go live life really unaware of the fact that we're just going off and judging life, and we're going to begin living through that bundle of experiences. That's the way the story has to be understood in order for it to be interpreted. So that 7 and 3 right there then represents a point in time in somebody's life where they're at that pure point, that pure state. Each person, every human, as a child. Presumably, if you came from there, some children are abused before they can even remember. But in the way the stories work here, it's to denote a time in your life when before first sin, which means before we got hurt. 7-3 is a starting point. We want to get back to there. That's why later we're going to be told by Jesus, a child 7 years old is going to know the place. That's that pure state. We want to get back to there. And they're going to be using numbers repetitively throughout the Bible to replicate that. 7 and 3, they can't replicate all the time. They need more numbers. So they're going to start gathering up numbers that are going to be repeated in the Bible. Let's take a look at some of what I'm talking about. Actually, before I do that, let me talk about a very quick repeating motif. It doesn't have to do with the numbers, but it's a pattern. What we're going to see right here after this part of the story where Cain and Abel come about, that division occurs right there. What happens, though, is Cain leaves the presence of the Lord. God is not present at all. God is not mentioned again until people begin to call upon the name of the Lord at the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6, his sons come down and, violate. There's something really weird in the story that's going on there. God returns when it's time to call Noah. And just, Noah is where the monomyth picks up. This is the called hero. Noah becomes the called hero, but God returns to call the hero. If you were to back up and go to the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, we're going to see that the creator god Apsu is destroyed and is gone while things go bad, is not there to control things. Only returns after Marduk, the called hero, returns to destroy everything, and there's a start over again in the same way of Noah. And if you looked in Genesis and checked how many times Noah's name is repeated, it's 41. If you look in the Enuma Elish for Marduk, it's 41. Both called heroes. They're replicating something much bigger than we even know. All right, now I haven't said this, but it should start coming online as you think about it, that what this flow is the flow of a human life. Generally how we come about, how life goes bad, how we wake up and say, oh my God, I'm a product of my memories. I have to stop doing that. I've got to forgive and forget and love and let things go. And we learn to move on from that. That is what this is about. If you followed it, if you understood it, it is closer to a Buddha path than anything else. It is self-examination. When I get down here, I'm going to look at something. We've got sevenfold and sevenfold repeated 2 times. We're going to start seeing something happening here that is code. The sevenfold and sevenfold, we've had 7 and 3 already. This 7 is going to be utilized then. It's a good number, and it's grabbing up a 70. Since it's surrounding that 70, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 7 and that 3, and I'm going to put them in a list that says this is pure. Then I'm going to take that 70, because those are there, and say, you know what? I'm going to put them on the same list. What they want to do every time that 70 comes up, it's going to mean that same place. They're going to begin developing more analogs that go back to that same place that don't sound so repetitive. How do I know this? Because this is just going to keep happening extensively. Let's look at it. All right, what I've got up is an incomplete count of the number analog count. I call it the 3-7 grid. Eden, 7 is repeated 3 times there. Conscious and inner self are in a pure state. This is a childhood state before you have not collected life judgments. And they're going to utilize some pattern somehow to maintain this story repetitively without it sounding that way. All right, Eden, pure soul state. You see I've got the 3 right here. You see I've got the 7 right here. And then because the 7 and the sevenfold appeared twice around the 70, I gathered up the 70. That's how it starts. Look how many there are. All right, this is supposed to be about that 900 years, though, and that's what I'm working up to, that they're utilizing numbers now, the 7 and the 3, to go out and gather up other numbers. But that's going to look too repetitive. It really will. If I get down here into 5, this is why I want to use the King James Version. Take a look here. It says N130. Here we've got 800. Here we've got 930. N105. 807. Now you go to the NRSV and they've got that changed to 130, 800, 930, 105. It doesn't have the and in there. You look at this and you go, well, that's just the way they did it. It's old. But if I keep moving along, I find things. I don't find it here, but in the second lineage, it's in chapter 11. Let me get there. I'm going to show you some things here that should get your attention. They got mine. All right, here we go. And Arphaxad said lived 5 and 30 years. What happened there? We just went into like a backward speak or something like that. 5 and 30. 4 and 30. 2 and 30. 9 and 20 instead of 29. And I begin to think, as I'm looking at these further, I see even more reason to question them. I see 30 appear often throughout the Bible. Look there's a 7, 807. 7 appears all over. There's 7s everywhere. Here's a 912. 12s appear all over. I look at that second number and go, God, you know what? I see these so often that I just wonder. I really wonder. What does that 900 mean? What if I come over here and search for it in the navigation? How many times does 900 appear? In Genesis, it's exactly 7 times. They're using 900 as a 7, as a surrogate for a 7 to gather up these other numbers. The 30, the 12. 12, what happens? Pure state. That's when God calls Abram and Sarai. Yeah, right there. What is 7? 7 is pure state. What chapter does the flood happen? Chapter 7. This is going to be happening at a micro and a macro level. The chapters are going to be following the same pattern of you start out pure, things go bad, you conquer something, you destroy something, you heal, you move on. You divide, and it happens again and again. Anyway, that's what the 900s are for. Look what happens if we do 800. We have 7 of those as well. those are also being used as a surrogate. And look what we have, 807. That's a 7 and a 7. That's doubling up there you go. Grab those numbers. But you would have to have this deeply memorized to know that. Look at what I'm doing here. I'm using the computer to know that. I wouldn't know that otherwise. I look at this and go, phew, no wonder we're not catching on. We're not seeing this. It needs a different kind of analysis that would happen if we had them deeply memorized, but since we don't, we're not accessing that level of the material. This goes on deeper. I just wanted to say that. Look, I want to show you something else. 7-3 at the beginning of the story, I'm going to show you something that is magical. All right, give this a few in order to see the consistency in all Abrahamic material, all of it, Old Testament and New Testament, and even apocryphal material. Here we've got his 7 sons and 3 daughters right at the beginning of Job. What is that? A 7 and a 3 male-female component. When we get to verse 3, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. Camels is repeated 3 times. Oxen is repeated 3 times throughout the document right here. So what we're seeing is that this is going to replicate the pure state. This is going to be a story about each person. Everybody is Job. Everybody's life experience is Job's life experience. But we're starting out in the beginning of life in a pure state. And then there's a temptation that happens, and then life comes apart. That's going to be a repeating motif. But the 7 and the 3 are there at the beginning of the stories. Let's go look at somewhere else. I want to show you something in Matthew, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David. You see David said 17 times, so that's a good one. The son of Abraham, 7. We're pure state at the beginning. All right, honestly, at some point I experiment around and I assume it's at some point that I'm looking at code, but the code just repeats the same way. Here's where I gather up the 17th right there. It's going to happen a couple of times here, but we see in the 600th, that's a good number. There's a lot to this. I glazed over that part right there. If 6 is a good number, then 60 is a good number, and 600 is a good number, and 6,000 is a good number. Adding zeros onto it doesn't seem to affect anything. A 7 is good as a 70 is as good as a 700 is as good as a 7,000. It's a way to make this number sound different when they're really not. You know what, though? It's analogous terms and metaphorical verbiage, though. Do you know this old Dr. Demento song? That's actually how I think I can illustrate it best. You're a bubble off plumb, there's a screw loose somewhere. Your elevator doesn't quite make it to the highest floor. And I don't remember what other parts of the verbiage are, but all of those mean the same thing despite sounding different. They're all that there's something wacko upstairs. Now, when we get here, it's the same thing. The number means pure state. 7, that's pure state. 70, pure state. 700, pure state. They're all meaning that same analogous location right there. That is a mental space hidden in verbiage that has you looking out in the world and trying to figure out what's going on out there when it's tricky stuff for upstairs. Noah, name repeated 41 times. Second, I don't recall how many, but that's a good one. 17. So 17 is one time there. That's not enough. Where else does it appear? 17 as a number appears again in the ark, which is repeated 27 times. 20 and 7 are good numbers. Rested 3 times. 7th month, 3, 7, 17. So I'm going to see that 17 keeps showing up, being pointed to by numbers that I've already collected that are good. Therefore, the 17 is gathered up and becomes one of the numbers as well. It's that simple. If I were to now assume that that's a pure state, if that's a 17, is that right? How about Sarai? We're talking about starting a pattern, a template over with from a pure state. Starts on chapter 12. We know that's a good number. Sarai's name is repeated exactly 17 times. That indicates a pure state to start with. But, yeah, you see what you have to do to gather it. That's why it's important to show David later on being repeated 17 times. They're following the exact same set of instructions to create these stories. And they're structuring them so that the pure person is what? Their name is repeated 17 times or 7 times or X amount of times. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas. Look at Judas right there. Throughout the book of Matthew, remember, Judas is the same as first sin. Oops. So throughout the story, Judas represents a negative element. And if you have any questions, if you had the story memorized and you knew that Judas's name was repeated 8 times, then you would know he's a bad guy. You would know David's a good guy. You would know Abraham's a good guy. By the coding of the story, yeah, you're gonna get more out of it. If we go down to where the story actually begins after the beginning lineage, what do we run into down here? When we get to verse 7, diligently is repeated 3 times in Matthew. Diligently right there. And star. Exactly 7 times. So we've got 3 acknowledgments in the beginning of Matthew. Let's look elsewhere. All right, let's go to Mark. Down to verse 3. Voice. 7 times. Crying, still in verse 3. 3 times. Let's go down to verse 7. There cometh one. Three times. Okay. Our 7th 3 is being maintained in the beginning of this story. I don't believe that's an accident because we're going to see it continue. All right, look, Luke, it seemed. 3 and understanding. Those are both there. But look at this one here, 7 and barren. Barren is 3 times. What we want is barren, honestly. When you think about the beginning, Elizabeth, barren, that means pure state. We're in the beginning. The analogs are different. The way that this story is carried is different. But this is the inner self with no offspring, no judgments. Barren. If you went analogously to the same point in Genesis with Abram and Sarai in chapter 12, with that point where we see her barren, what would be there was that they were both in Canaan in a land of famine. They had nothing. Here she has no offspring. There they had nothing to consume. She soon begot some offspring there, didn't she? Well, her husband did after trading herself to Pharaoh. Yeah, that's giving into temptation. All right, let's go to John. This one becomes kind of intensely different, but let's take a look at something here. We get down to 3. Are they maintaining it? All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made without. 7 times. Nothing made without him. 3-7 acknowledgement. 7, the same came. 3 times. 7-3, 3-7. It's tight. Let's jump around. Jeremiah is huge. It's a monomyth. We're going to jump down here to 7. Verse number 7. Thou shalt speak. There we have it. You cannot find Abrahamic material where it's absent. How about the man-made coup de grace revelation, the Revelation, King James Version? We get down to verse 3. What do we have? Blessed. 7 times. 3-7. There we have it. What about prophecy? It even says that too. That was an advanced student. They got 2 in. Yeah. Blessed and prophecy. Let's drop down to 7. We've got an even so in there. Three times. Even so. Behold. 7-3. All right. 1 apocryphal. Remember, we're looking for kind of pure state female. What do we have? 3. Daughter. 7 times. This is Susanna, apocryphal Gospel of Susanna, still being manufactured by the same class. Law. Remember in the beginning of the stories, it means the beginning of your life, the 3-7 pure state, 3 cause and effect. You're going to be living through cause and effect, starting from a pure state and then going through a corrupted state, unless you go through Susanna, where that is circumvented. 3 times 7. 7-3, husband. Husband, pure state still, husband. This one's pretty on the nose. Husband, 3. Yeah. You can see the male, female, male purity right here in the numbering pattern. Okay, I don't know if you can see that or not. It takes a while really to wrap your head around it. I want to try to keep the video short, but you cannot. They're so deep, and I have abbreviated the heck out of the number collection. It's like hard. I don't know how to demonstrate this. You can't do it quickly. It really is big, and it's deep, and it's there. But the person has to look at it for themselves. You can now download, if you don't, I'm sure you have it already, or if you don't have it, just download anybody else, Genesis, onto your computer, and do that kind of searching, or any of the books of the Bible. Download them and do that kind of searching, and you're going to find all of that is revealed to you. This isn't me making something up. This is me finding something and saying, hey, look at this stuff right here. Yeah, it looks like a pattern that's there in place for a reason. The 7-3 grid. But it's a structured pattern. All right? We go to Genesis. What do we see right here? Noah's name, 41. Noah is the called hero. That's who God comes back and contacts and says, you are the one that's going to survive the other side. Noah, called hero, 41 times. Let's go to the Babylonian and Enuma Elish. All right, I've got everything, all 7 tablets here. All right, Marduk. He's the called hero. 41 times. Marduk is who got Apsu. Apsu is the creator. Apsu is gone. Apsu returns when it's time for Marduk to be born. God returns when it's time for Noah to destroy Earth. See the motif, the repeating motif, and even the numbering pattern that's identical there. All right, so I'll just show that real quick. Anyway, it takes a long time to see it, and it takes a lot of work to get into it. And I think people just right off the bat, they've heard about the numbering stuff so much that they just dismiss it out of hand and saying, yeah, I've heard that before. Not this. This is not what other people are doing. This is something that a 12-year-old kid 5,000 years ago who had this memorized deeply could do. And today we can't. Yes, we can. We just have to use the computer to supplement our brains, the memory that we don't have in place. See you in the next video.